I want to thank you all for joining us today, and F.E.A.S.T is very pleased to speak to you who are involved in this recent news. And we want to give some context for our parent audience about the paper that's come out, the press around it, and how it relates to future work in genomics. But first, let's say hello to you. We have Dr. Cynthia Bulik. She is an advisor for F.E.A.S.T, but she's also the founding director of the UNC Center of Excellence for Eating Disorders at UNC. And we have Dr. Gerome Breen, who is the associate professor at King's College London. And we have Erica Husain, who is the chair of Charlotte's Helix. And before we get to the news, I'd love you to introduce yourselves and tell us how each of you are related to this recent news. And we'll start with Dr. Bulik.
Thanks, Laura. Thanks for doing this talk today. It's really great to be able to talk to families about this study. I served as the lead principal investigator of ANGI, which is one of the main contributors of the Anorexia Nervosa Genetics Initiative. And then along with Gerome, who's also with us today, I'm the co-chair of the Eating Disorders Working Group of the Psychiatric Genomics Consortium.
Fantastic. Dr. Breen.
And as Cindy said, I work closely with her in the Psychiatric Genomics Consortium Eating Disorders Work Group. And that was the other main contributor to this particular work.
And Ms. Husain.
Well, I'm a parent advocate for eating disorders, long time in that role, long time with F.E.A.S.T also, and then came more latterly in the last few years to be a small part of this project in terms of the UK and bringing us into being able to contribute in some way to the research and working with King's College London.
Fantastic. And I'm Laura Collins Lyster-Mensh. I'm the executive director for F.E.A.S.T and a very excited promoter of what all of you are doing. The recent paper that came out in Nature has a very long name. So if one of you has it at hand, let's hear it. It's unintelligible to normal human beings, but it is the paper that we're talking about. Do you have it?
I have it right in front of me. So it's first off, it was in Nature Genetics.
Sorry.
No apologies necessary. The title was Genome-Wide Association Study Identifies 8 Risk Loci and Implicates Metabo-Psychiatric Origins for Anorexia Nervosa. Yeah.
So I've waited many, many years to hear those lovely words, even if they're unintelligible. Can we really just kind of break it down rather simply? This is really big news, right?
I consider it to be fairly big news, yeah, because basically it gave us a result that we weren't expecting. And in the broadest sort of brushstrokes terms, it tells us that there may be both psychiatric and metabolic origins to anorexia nervosa.
Sounds big to me. So you said that you were surprised. Dr. Breen, were you surprised?
Yeah, I think the eating disorders community was surprised in general, right? The clinical community by this finding. And I think it has been obvious that eating disorders are pretty much only treated from a psychological point of view. But I guess maybe I've come into this with a bit of hindsight or so on, but I tend to not to want to make assumptions about the origins of things.
You're a scientist.
So I think it's I think what's unusual about anorexia is that of the psychiatric disorders that we've examined, anorexia is the only one with this sort of this mix of metabolic and psychiatric, and it's clearly metabolic and clearly psychiatric. I think that's really the most interesting thing.
From the parent advocate point of view, Ms. Husain, what do you think?
Definitely a surprise to see that additional piece. I mean, it's lovely we were expecting sort of, more detail or more evidence to be coming along about the genetic nature and the biological side, but didn't really understand that there would be this, significant piece on the metabolic side, which was, yeah, definitely a surprise.
Are there some myths that are being dispelled through this research? Does this not only move us forward, but change some things that we used to believe?
I hope so.
I have one that I think is sort of interesting, because one of the results that sort of bubbled to the top was a positive genetic correlation with accelerometer measured physical activity.
Mm.
We all know that people with anorexia nervosa are highly physically active, even when they're at very low body weight. And we have often sort of psychologized our interpretation of that. We've blamed patients for, doing sit-ups in their room or pacing or not being able to sit still. And although there is probably an intentional component to that, this also suggests that there are some underlying shared genetic factors between anorexia nervosa and high physical activity. So there might actually be a biological underpinning to that increased or elevated physical activity as well.
Very interesting.
Yes, and I think that is certainly a critical thing. I mean, what we've found does not change anorexia as an illness, right? The illness remains the same illness. But I think what it means is that, as Cindy just said, that we have to think carefully about the origins of the symptoms of the illness. And I think that's where I see the metabolism also coming in. It will act as a push on someone's psychology and learned behaviors. And the physical activity finding may or may not be as a result of metabolic rate or some other component. But all of those things are then acting on a person to generate the behaviors that lead to anorexia. Yeah.
And
I just, sorry, Laura.
Go on.
I was going to say, I just find that those pieces of the puzzle, that the behaviors you've observed in your own family, potentially the behaviors that you've heard about in other people's that you've observed, begin to make a lot of sense. That sort of that drive for the movement, that the OCD components, those sort of things, all those pieces of the puzzle fit together so perfectly from what you've seen and felt and observed.
And I think Erica really hit on probably the strongest genetic correlation that we did observe, and that was the genetic correlation between anorexia and OCD. And that is one of the stronger correlations between any pair of psychiatric disorders that we've seen in the field. And I think the interesting thing about that is the genetics are mirroring what we see in the clinic, because so often we see OCD going hand in hand with anorexia nervosa, and now we know that there is a genetic component to that co-occurrence or coexistence of those illnesses.
It's really very interesting, and I think for the parent community, I think they're feeling validated. I think that patients are feeling validated, and that our intuitions and that our observations and that clinical observations are coming together. This is really moving in the right direction. One of the questions I'm getting from families is, didn't we already know this? Meaning that I think there is an impression out there that we already knew about the genetics of eating disorders because we've been talking about the genetics of eating disorders. Can you clear up why this tells us something that we didn't know before?
Mm-hmm. Gerome, you want to take that from the genetic perspective and then I can add to it?
Yeah. So I think, Cindy and many other people have led work on twins and families and, for decades. And I think what's true to say is that for a long time, we've had a good picture of the overall genetic contribution to anorexia from twin and family studies. However, that was not actually investigating which genes were involved. It was actually just using the fact that identical twins come in two different varieties and to estimate the overall genetic effect. What we're doing recently, right, is using a relatively new but rapidly maturing technology called genome-wide association studies to try and find specific genes and also then look at the similarities of the overall molecular genetic architecture of anorexia with the genetics of other disorders and traits. And the key thing about this study is that with the twin and family design, we would never have seen the metabolic links, because in a twin and family design, you have to measure all of the phenotypes you want to test. Whereas with GWAS, genome-wide association studies, all you need is for a GWAS to have been done in another trait and to be able to access the summary results of that study and see how similar they are to the results of the study of anorexia.
Would it be fair to say that the knowledge that we had knowing about twin studies and family studies led to what you're being able to do now, and that all of this leads to the next step? And now I want to ask you about what's the next step.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if for example, that those decades of family and twin studies have told us that eating disorders don't run in families and they're not heritable, then we wouldn't have had good rationale to go and do this massive work, on the genomic studies. And, Gerome mentioned that now we've identified these 8 loci or areas on the genome associated with anorexia. But this is both a breakthrough and a beginning at the same time, which I know is kind of hard to fathom, but it's true, because we're going to expand our sample size and we're expecting there to actually be hundreds and maybe even thousands of genes involved. And as we grow the sample and get more hits above that magic line that says this is a significant place to look at, those genes start assorting themselves in biological pathways more clearly than we're able to see now. And then this information might well be used to figure out exactly what those metabolic pathways are that are disrupted and potentially how to intervene to change them. Down the line, we might be looking at drug targets that are based on metabolic factors, not necessarily psychiatric factors. But that's precisely why we need to go farther. We tell people we had 16,992 participants and their eyes get wide saying, wow, that's such a big study. But it's actually just sort of a moderately sized GWAS. Our next steps in EDGI, or the Eating Disorders Genetics Initiative, to go to 100,000. So we've got more work to do.
Yes. I mean, it was a big study. I mean, the other way to think about it is that it's something like 111 so 111 billion genetic data points, and so it's quite a lot of data to get on a set of anorexia cases. But it's remarkable, and the Angie initiative was particularly remarkable in terms of gathering that number of cases in such an efficient way. The progress of anorexia genetics, although it was relatively slow to start, is now outstripping quite a few other psychiatric disorders. But of course, and Cindy mentioned EDGI, the Eating Disorders Genetic Initiative. But part of the goal of EDGI is to ensure that we have the same level of progress in each of the other eating disorders, starting with bulimia and binge eating disorder.
That was my next question. So a lot of parents, very few parents, including our family, wouldn't have qualified for a strict diagnosis of anorexia nervosa. Mm-hmm. And so most of us don't. The idea that this wasn't just to help with anorexia, but to lead the way to be able to help with other eating disorders. EDGI is going to be broader based in diagnosis. Is that right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And the Charlotte's Helix project, which was in the UK, and parents, you should know, was initiated and led by parent volunteers who, just a bunch of us really felt like this was important and we wanted to support this work. It may seem like these big things that are happening, are only scientists, but all of the human beings who stepped up to donate, and the people like Erica and her team who have been working on Charlotte's Helix, it's very exciting that we as the community have been able to be involved too. And when we look at these results coming out, we get very excited. Ms. Husain, do you have anything to say on that topic?
Oh, well, seeing the results coming out, seeing it, that is front page news last week was just, you know, outstanding, amazing. Because it's like you say, it's stuff that we had that knowledge already, thanks to work that, you know, people like Professor Bulik already been doing, that there's, you know, genes are involved. We knew that, we believed it within our own community. We understood that to a level. But for that to be on the front pages and in the news and talked about on the television and the radio, and it's just that brings it to a level where it's moving into a mainstream conversation, and that's really, really gratifying to see.
We are certainly seeing that in our community at large, and we are all very grateful to you, Dr. Breen, Dr. Bulik. We are so appreciative and thankful to you for doing this interview. And we, of course, are going to point everyone to all of the links that we've been talking about, all of the conversations that are going on. And I know that our community is very keen to help out in the next steps with EDGI. So count on us, and we will all be cheering for you. Thank you very, very much.
Thanks, Laura. And thanks to all the families and all the people who had anorexia at some point in their life who participated. F.E.A.S.T has been a great partner, and the parents have supported this research, and it's actually been awesome to work hand in hand with them toward this finding. So thank you all.
Yes, and without the help of the community, we won't be able to make progress in eating disorders research beyond this, because, you know, certainly the psychiatry research, etc., is not set up in the right way to make progress in eating disorders, and we need the help of families to do that.
Fantastic. Let's keep going, and we'll all be cheering. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Laura.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.